carrier
All right,
off
Joe,
the East Coast. That'll be adopted.
Okay, I'm going to interrupt you, and I apologize because the House is about to come in. Joe Papalardo with Popular Mechanics, his cover story, The Future of War. Thank you for joining us on C-SPAN's Washington Journal as part of our Spotlight Magazine series. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Greta. I had a good time.
And now live coverage of the House. They'll be debating that Pentagon spending bill with amendments in debate on NSA data collection, Syria, Egypt, and Afghanistan.
House will be in order. The chair before the House communication from the Speaker.
The Speaker's Rooms, Washington, D.C., July 24, 2013. I hereby appoint the Honorable Daniel Webster to act as Speaker pro tempore on this day. Signed, John A. Boehner, Speaker of the House of Representatives.
Pursuant to the order of the House of January 3, 2013, the Chair will now recognize members from lists submitted by the majority and minority leaders for morning hour debate. The Chair will alternate recognition between the parties, with each party limited to 1 hour and each member other than the majority and minority leaders and the minority whip limited to 5 minutes. But in no event shall the debate go beyond 11:50 a.m. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Wolf. 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, today I've come to the floor to raise the 7th in a series of critical but unanswered questions about the terrorist attacks on the U.S. consulate and annex in Benghazi last September 11. Despite a year of investigation in a number of committees, the American people still do not know the answers to these questions, nor do they know if they have even been asked. With only 5 legislative days remaining before the Congress departs for August recess, I'm increasingly concerned that none of these questions will be answered by the 1-year anniversary of the Benghazi attack. According to a recent excerpt in the forthcoming book, Under Fire, The Untold Story of the Attack at Benghazi, which was published in this month's Vanity Fair magazine, Ambassador Stevens made several calls for help after reaching what he believed was a safe room on the consulate compound. As we well know now, one call was placed to his Deputy Chief of Mission, Gregory Hicks, who was at the U.S. Embassy in Tripoli. In May, Hicks provided powerful testimony about that final conversation with Stevens. He also called local militia and public security commanders in Benghazi, pleading for help. What I found interesting in the Vanity Fair excerpt is that Stevens also made calls to nearby consulates on the BlackBerry of someone on a security detail. Assuming the authors are correct, the government must have the phone records from Stevens' calls to the militia and foreign consulate that night. This raises the important question of which foreign consulates did he call, and how did these consulates respond? If Stevens was calling foreign consulates, it also begs the question, did U.S. officials in Tripoli or Washington call any allies with assets in Libya to help respond to the attack? Furthermore, did the Pentagon connect any NATO allies with military assets in the region that could have provided assistance that night? Given how close many of the European allies are to the Mediterranean, would they have planes or response teams stationed in locations in or nearby the region that could have mobilized upon a request from Washington? After speaking of forced posture, what have we done to ensure that if another incident were to happen this September 11, that we're prepared to respond? We're less than 2 months away from 9/11 anniversary, but the American people don't know whether we're anywhere capable of responding to an incident in North Africa or the Middle East. The American people have lost confidence in this investigation. We can help restore it with a bipartisan select committee. I yield back.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Hoyer, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I've come to this floor nearly every week since the sequester took effect in March to highlight its dangerous consequences to our national security, its harmful impact on our economy, and the pain it is causing the most vulnerable people in our country. Now, with the sequester in its 21st week, this Congress has still not achieved the big, balanced, and bipartisan solution to deficits that we need to replace the sequester and put America back on a sound fiscal path. Only such an agreement, Mr. Speaker, can provide a viable alternative to the irrational cuts this sequestration has imposed. Those cuts are already exacerbating the many challenges we face as a nation. Later this week, I will be delivering meals to seniors in my district with the Meals on Wheels program, which could be delivering 4 million fewer meals nationwide as a result of sequester. One small business owner from my district recently reached out to my staff to say that he was personally impacted by Meals on Wheels when the grandmother who raised him was diagnosed with cancer and came to rely on Meals on Wheels during the final part of her life. He couldn't believe that after all the good work the Prince George's County Meals on Wheels office had done, that they were being forced to reduce their operations significantly as a result of the sequester. Surely, Mr. Speaker, the richest country on the face of the earth does not need to leave people, particularly seniors, who can't get out, hungry. Other harmful effects of the most vulnerable Americans include an 11% cut to emergency unemployment insurance payments and 125,000 fewer rental assistance vouchers. Mr. Speaker, as many as 70,000 children could be kicked out of Head Start. They're only going to be 4 once, including approximately 800 children in my own state. I read on Monday in the Washington Post about the Whitney Young Head Start Center in Yonkers, New York, Mr. Speaker, which has served primarily Hispanic families for more than 12 years, teaching kids English and providing them medical services and meals. It closed down on Friday, a victim of sequestration. And on Monday, an article in the Huffington Post drew attention to an effective sequester that represents a dangerous undermining of justice. And that is the cut to public defenders who represent defendants in the federal court system who cannot afford their own attorneys. This fulfills the constitutional requirement that everyone is entitled to legal representation. It can't be waived. That report in the Washington Post, and I quote, "The public defender system hasn't just been stripped bare by sequestration, its bones have been chiseled away as well." Mr. Speaker, can we risk delaying justice for victims and their families because our country can't afford public defenders? Do we want cases dismissed against people who have done wrong because the Constitution says they have to have a defense that we can't afford, apparently? I met yesterday with Maryland District Court judges, about 8 of them, and they raised this issue as one of critical importance. And one of the judges, a Reagan appointee, was obviously very animated at how we were undermining the very essence of the judicial system. Surely no one on this floor intends to do that. At the Defense Department, 650,000 civilian workers are already being furloughed 2 days a month. That's an effective cut in pay of 20% for hardworking people on whom we rely to maintain the national security of our country. On July 2nd, I visited with civilian defense workers from Pax River Naval Air Station in St. Mary's County. And I heard from my constituents there who are being forced to stay home from work without pay. They were certainly concerned about their families' finances, but, Mr. Speaker, these hardworking and patriotic public servants were far more worried about furloughs' effect on our military readiness and support for our troops in the field on those Fridays when many are forced to stay home and not at their post. Legally, they can't even come to work and volunteer their time. The sequester is hurting morale and putting our security at risk, Mr. Speaker, at a moment when our troops are still in harm's way every single day. Fridays, otherwise known as furlough days, included. I'll be going to another installation in Maryland's 5th District on Friday, Mr. Speaker, the Naval Surface Warfare Center at Indian Head, to meet with civilian employees there. I will tell them that Congress has the ability to end the furloughs they are experiencing. Now, we have the ability to keep those kids from losing Head Start and our seniors for losing meals. We have that ability now. We can do so by coming together in a bipartisan way to replace the sequester with a balanced alternative that includes spending cuts and, yes, revenues. This is what Budget Committee Ranking Member Chris Van Hollen has put forward 7 times, Mr. Speaker, only to see it prevented by the majority from receiving a vote. The Speaker says, let the House work its will. Well, perhaps this is the will of the House. I hope not. I urge my colleagues to work together across the aisle so we can end the sequester, and restore fiscal discipline in a way that does not harm our security, our economy, the most vulnerable in our country, or America itself. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Members are reminded not to traffic in the well when someone is speaking from the well. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Ridgell, for 5 minutes.
I thank the Speaker. I come to the floor this morning to call for a change in the House calendar. Mr. Speaker, leaders set priorities. They identify the challenges and opportunities that face their organization. And they assess them and put them in the right order, and then they align their organization's calendar to make sure that those top priorities get addressed. That's what the American people rightfully expect of each of us. Overall, our calendar and the priorities of the House are right on track. I'm so proud of the legislation that we passed that would move America to energy independence and create hundreds of thousands of jobs. But in one very critical area, we're seriously off track. Our calendar does not reflect the challenges and the top priorities of our country. Specifically, we're not on track to pass all 12 appropriations bills that fund the federal government for 2014. Fact is, we're not even close to passing those bills. And with our current congressional calendar, I cannot possibly see a way that we can pass those bills by September 30th, which is the end of the current fiscal year. This is not without consequence. It damages our economy, job creation. It damages our military in a very real way. And ultimately, it hurts hardworking American families. Now, let's look at the status of the 12 bills and then look at the time that remains on the congressional calendar to debate and pass those bills, and time to avoid what's referred to as a continuing resolution. And make no mistake here, a continuing resolution is wholly inadequate as a financial vehicle to fund this government. It has serious adverse consequences. And that's why this topic merits careful attention of this body, and that's why it merits a change in our congressional calendar. Well, here are the 12 bills that must be passed. We passed 4 of them. Well, that leaves 8. My math's pretty good there. 12 bills, 4 have been completed. Now, this past due here, they're not past due right now, but they surely will be, at least some of them. As I mentioned, this has serious repercussions. I've spent a tremendous amount of time in our district listening to the hard-working men and women who keep our country safe and those who support them. Every time we pass a continuing resolution, our military reels with uncertainty. We have a deep obligation to the young men and women around the world who are keeping this country safe to use every dollar wisely to ensure that we get the very best equipment and support to each of them. That's why I feel so strongly about this issue, and it burdens me when we fail the American people in this respect. Well, let's look on at the calendar and see what we've got to work with here. Mr. Speaker, we have 15 calendar days. They're indicated right here in the teal-green color. These areas here represent constituent work periods. I work really hard in our constituent work periods, and I know really every member here does. It's important that we're in our districts. There's value to that, to listen to be accountable to the good folks who sent us up here. That said, a principal function and what the American people are expecting of us is that we pass these 12 appropriations bills. So, if what is referred to as the August recess is brought to this body for a vote, I will vote no. I'll encourage every member of this body to vote no, Democrat, Republican. When an organization is facing profound challenges, you do what you must do to set it in a better course. It may be house tradition to break, but I submit that it's not wise. Mr. Speaker, I really believe we ought to be in session 6 days a week, starting at 8 a.m., earlier if it was up to me, and ending at around 7 p.m. 6 days a week. I'm convinced that just that pressure alone would help us find some common ground that I know exists in this place. That's why I call for a change in the calendar, and I yield back.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I listened to my friend from Virginia. I respect his opinion, but with all due respect, I think we've got a more fundamental problem than the calendar. The Republican leadership refuses to allow a conference committee on the budget between the House and the Senate to reconcile our differences. We can be here 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, but if the Republican leadership refuses to allow the process to work, we're not going to get anywhere. And that's right where we are right now. My friends on the Appropriations Committee refuse to deal with the budget level that was passed into law 2 years ago that charted us on a course. They have a level of funding that is literally slashing and burning federal spending. The latest manifestation of this battle is putting in jeopardy the very existence of public broadcasting. Now, I would have hoped that we were past that last year when the last Congress targeted NPR and tried to defund the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Luckily then, the 170 million Americans who don't just listen or watch public broadcasting, but depend on it, unleashed an unprecedented show of support. And as a result, the Republican leadership walked back then. One good thing about that budget battle 2 years ago was that it called for a study to look for alternatives for the 14% of federal money that supports public broadcasting. Well, the study's in, and it clearly shows there's no viable alternative to those 14 cents on the dollar. Many of the proposals that have been suggested would actually result in less money overall for public broadcasting in the long term. Yet, House Appropriations Bill, we're told, is going to eliminate Corporation for Public Broadcasting funding. Last summer, I had a fascinating conversation with my friend Ken Burns, who pointed out that his 6 projects in the pipeline would never have been made, let alone seen, without funding for the Corporation of Public Broadcasting. So I hope you enjoyed his show last fall about the Dust Bowl, because if the Republicans have their way, you'll never see his program about the Roosevelts, Jackie Robinson, Vietnam, or Hemingway. Remember how well it worked for Governor Romney when he singled out public broadcasting as one of the 5 projects that he would defund? The Republicans, sadly, pander to a tiny fraction of the American public that is even a minority in their own party. Polls show 2/3 of Republican survey would either keep funding for public broadcasting where it is or increase it. What resonates with some Republican primary voters is not what America wants, needs, or believes. The unprecedented threat comes at exactly the time when America needs public broadcasting the most. NPR News, the object of greatest Republican scorn, is the most trusted brand in American news media. PBS shows like Sesame Street have helped raise 3 generations of raise their children with effective commercial-free educational programming. Locally owned news is becoming only a memory for most America as large corporations buy up local stations and newspapers. There's no money to be made by commercial stations that cater to the special needs of rural and small-town America. Luckily, public broadcasting is there because their mission is to inform and serve, not just make a profit. We must stop this attack on the critical service, especially for rural and small-town America. It's time for the 170 million Americans who depend on public broadcasting every month to again fight back and for Congress to finally listen. The radical proposal to slash public broadcasting, defund NPR, terminate public broadcasting as we know it, is a powerful step of a symbol of how far out of step the Republican leadership is from the country they're supposed to represent. There's no reason to make public broadcasting, which Barry Goldwater helped launch, into a partisan issue. Public broadcasting has broad support from Republicans, Independents, and Democrats alike. That's why PBS and its member stations were named #1 in public trust and an excellent use of tax dollars for 10 years in a row. It's time for the people who believe in public broadcasting to stand up to this extremism and settle the question once and for all about the future of public broadcasting. Unless we fight now, there may be nothing to defend.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Guzar, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll keep it brief. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to shed light on Attorney General Eric Holder's blatant disregard for the rule of law. Mr. Holder's violation of the law are egregious, and he should not be immune from the prosecution or given license to act without restraint. An ordinary citizen would go to jail for selling guns to Mexican drug cartels. An ordinary citizen would go to jail for secretly obtaining phone records and emails. An ordinary citizen would go to jail for lying to Congress about an investigation. What would happen to an ordinary citizen for lying to a judge? This is just a small part of what Attorney General Eric Holder is responsible for. As Supreme Court Justice Brandeis said, in a government of laws, the existence of government will be imperiled if it fails to observe the law scrupulously. If government becomes a lawbreaker, it breeds contempt for law. It invites every man to become a law unto himself. It invites anarchy. I ask you, has Attorney General Eric Holder invited anarchy? I will continue to make this case here in the People's House at the People's Pulpit. And folks, I will be back. I yield back.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Quigley, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we can do better. When it comes to legislatively establishing a national energy policy to address climate change, we can and must do better. But we're not. As members of this body, we're not doing anything. Why? We are hamstrung by our inability to work together to do great, important, vital things here in this chamber. Things like addressing our national debt, tackling comprehensive immigration reform, and to ever in the history of this nation establish a national energy plan. The only way forward is to establish a national energy plan to address climate change, something this great nation has always lacked, and to work with public and private entities alike to get this done. And for the climate doubters out there who still question climate change, I remind them that over 200 peer-reviewed scientific studies have said that climate change is real and that man contributes significantly to it, and 0 scientific peer-reviewed studies have said the opposite. So we must craft a plan that focuses on working with the business community hand in hand to be competitive internationally. We must go toe-to-toe with India and China. We must craft a plan that focuses on public transportation and green infrastructure. We must pass a multi-year transportation bill. We must focus on conservation, as demonstrated so adeptly by our own President's increase in corporate average fuel economy standards and his call to action on climate just a few weeks ago. And above all, we must compromise, work together, and we must be inventive and creative. I'm not calling on the President for another executive order. I'm not calling on the Senate to move one more piecemeal energy bill that lies holed up in committee. I'm calling on this House. I know what the critics will say, and my argument is the same as theirs. It's about jobs. Setting standards for carbon pollution limits for coal plants under the Clean Air Act will not shutter all U.S. plants, as some will have you believe. On the contrary, it will set achievable standards for existing plants until we can use a patchwork solution to transition to cleaner sources. Still others will say the Clean Air Act is a draconian doctrine that kills jobs, slows down American progress, and sets us back as technology-advanced nation. Right? Wrong. The Clean Air Act has been the impetus for the only existing technologies that currently exist for power plants, having been required to reduce emittance by 90% by 2015. Without such directives coming out of the EPA over the last 40 years, such advancements by polluting power plants would never have been voluntarily made. We can transition with incentives and a patchwork approach and compromise. So several weeks ago, when the President made a major drive on combating climate change, it's too bad he had to bypass Congress to do it. But as a member of this body, I don't blame him. I'd love to say we here in this chamber could be part of the solution, but I understand why he believes we cannot. Since Congress has abdicated its desire to pass climate legislation, natural gas has become a panacea for fossil fuel. It's dirt cheap and cleaner, they say, but it's brought about a renaissance of dirty extraction like hydrofracking or extracting gas from shale in oftentimes negligent and toxic manner. Also, our nuclear energy can't compete with China's solar energy. China provided over half the solar panel cells in the U.S. That's over $3.1 billion within our domestic market. $3.1 billion we could be capitalizing on, infusing small and mid-sized solar companies across the country, creating and retaining green jobs. Our attempt to deregulate or fight rules promulgated from the EPA isn't working either. Take the bill we're considering this week, the Coal Residues Reuse and Management Act, which would set up a separate management stream which would bypass the EPA. Per the Congressional Research Service, this federal minimum standard, as established by the bill, pays no mind to public health. The CRS memo written at the request of the House Energy and Commerce Committee states that this bill fails to establish minimum national safeguards, fails to establish federal backstop authority, fails to define what facilities the bill applies to, fails to contain any minimum federal requirement to protect health and the environment. It's time this body became a relevant advocate and participant in solving the great questions that plague our nation today, before we lose a chance to have a tomorrow. Thank you, and I yield back.
Chair recognizes a gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Thompson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's been a tough week for the American consumers. Yesterday it was reported that under the Federal Bureau of Land Management new proposed onshore hydraulic fracturing regulations, businesses will suffer, as well as the rate of production in developing our nation's plentiful natural gas. Yes, a clean and affordable resource. Reuters News reports, and I quote, "The Obama administration hopes the rules on public lands will serve as a model for state oversight of drilling on private lands." End of quote. This plan is no secret. The U.S. Interior Secretary Sally Joel said as much in her testimony before the House Natural Resource Committee in July. Make no mistake, these federal regulations are being developed as a model to be used across the country. The development of our nation's domestic energy resources has been one of the few bright spots in a struggling economy. And it's very clear now why this era of growth and innovation came to be. Take a look at the production rates on state and private lands versus federal lands, and you'll see why. Production is up on the former and way down on the latter. Unfortunately, the administration wants to close this gap by putting the federal government in control and imposing costly new mandates everywhere that production is taking place. It's bad for business, Mr. Speaker. What's worse, it's bad for consumers by making the cost of heating their homes that much more expensive. And it doesn't stop with natural gas. Coal is also in the administration's crosshairs. Only with coal, the White House has a hair trigger, a scope, and a silencer. Case in point, a sweeping new coal regulation quietly being put forward by the administration known as the Stream Buffer Zone Rule. Yesterday, Joseph Pizarczyk, Director of the Federal Office of Surface Mining Reclamation Enforcement at the U.S. Department of Interior, testified before the House Natural Resource Committee on the new rule. The Interior Department has largely stonewalled the committee's investigation into the rewrite of the coal regulation and failed to comply with multiple subpoenas. Similar to the Director's testimony, the entire rulemaking process for this new regulation has lacked transparency. What we do know is that the administration has failed to even consider the new rule's economic impact on local economies, such as those in my home state of Pennsylvania. Unfortunately, the conduct of OSM is emblematic of the Obama administration's complete disregard for the health of our economy. As many as 220,000 jobs are at risk in the Appalachian region alone as a consequence of the proposed rule. Thousands more are at stake nationally. DOI regulations require that OSM collaborate, quote, to the fullest extent possible, end quotes, with states developing the rule. DOI regulations also require that OSM collaborate with states, quote, at the earliest possible times, end quote, so that all stakeholders can evaluate the role and consider possible alternatives. Yesterday, when asked whether or not states have been provided with information regarding the new role and related changes, the OSM director stated he does not believe that there had been any contact during the last year with impacted states. When further pressed as to whether his office has made contact with states and other cooperating agencies, the director stated that he was unaware of any such communications. Mr. Speaker, this White House will stop at no end to assault the fossil fuels industry, along with the millions of jobs it supports and the low energy costs that it provides. Mr. Speaker, protecting the environment and developing our abundant natural resources such as coal and natural gas are not mutually exclusive, but this is not something the administration would like to admit. This week, the administration continued to move ahead with the policies that will cost more jobs and further harm family budgets through higher electricity rates. This week, the administration continued to grossly underestimate the cumulative impact of their regulatory actions. And this week was another tough week for the American consumer. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, for 5 minutes.
Ask the Speaker to address the House unanimously.
Without objection.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I listened to many of my good friends and to our colleagues. We are, in fact, good friends and colleagues, hoping to do what is right on behalf of the American people. And I always appreciate and respect those individuals who have chosen to serve the nation. So I take issue very briefly with my good friend and colleague about the criminal acts of one of the most honest and forthright Attorney Generals of the United States of America. General Holder has not been charged with criminal activity except for the aggressive and desperate actions of our Republican friends. He has been noted for his great leadership on civil rights, criminal justice issues. He's been a leader on the prohibiting and fighting against human trafficking, and certainly he has been one who has stood up for our children in this nation and also the many law enforcement officers who are on the front lines protecting us here in America. I hope that we can respect those who offer themselves to the service of this nation for as long as General Eric Holder has done. I have listened to friends as well speak about the devastation of the sequester, and I again suggest to my colleagues that through H.R. 900, a simple bill that eliminates the sequester and go back to the budget reconciliation of 2011, and as well to force or to push this Republican majority to move to conference would be the better approach. I, too, have gone and delivered meals in the Meals on Wheels, and I see the faces of seniors who will now face serious cuts in this effort. I see the loss of 750,000 jobs. I see the impact on the economy where the unemployment has stayed somewhat static. But when you go into the business community and the hesitation, even though Wall Street is thriving, it all points to the fact of the sequester. It's become a dirty word. It's become one that has victimized the American public. It's victimized young families. It has victimized college students. It's victimized seniors. It's victimized those who are ill. And yet we continue to piece by piece, fixing the FAA problem, but not addressing the 70,000 children that are suffering and losing seats in Head Starts. I remember as the Head Start seats were being lost, fathers crying when they were told by the Head Start facility that their child would no longer have a seat. It seems sad that we would cut Head Start or disaster aid by $1 billion because we have Head Start, or the Department of Transportation, $1.9 billion, when many of us know that those are the basic reasons for job creation, is building America's infrastructure. We are yet, as we plod along with sequester, and we see good public workers not being able to work, and might I just say, let me thank our own staff, which gets condemned all the time. You work for a U.S. member of Congress, and every day our staff fights to help some constituent keep their house from being foreclosed on, or keep a Medicare recipient or continue to get their benefits, or veterans the person, and yet we are furloughing them. We're cutting people who are mere workers that are working for us, and they can't make ends meet. They're getting second jobs. It's a disgrace. It's an absolute disgrace. I'm not going to condemn House staff, committee staff, government staff. They are working for the American people. And then I want to offer a disagreement, Mr. Speaker. I know the Senate is going to vote on a student loan project or program. They say it's a compromise. Well, I've got to tell my students, because I've held campus meetings, we've met, I've got to tell them, and I've got to tell the parents, yes, they're going to get a low interest rate today, but watch out for tomorrow, because it's a trigger. Before you know it, they may be paying 10%. They say it's a cap. But I don't know what the cap is going to be as it relates to whether a student can pay 6% or 7% when they could stay at 3.4%. As someone said, why should the federal government be making money on the backs of students? I'm concerned about that. Finally, Mr. Speaker, let me say there's been a lot of discussion this week about issues of race, issues of the tragedy of Trayvon Martin. I intend to introduce the Justice Exists for All Act, a review, as Senator McCain has suggested, of the Stand Your Ground legislation across America. It will increase public safety. It will reduce the incident of gun violence by, among other things, by providing incentives for any state with a Stand Your Ground law to amend it to require a duty to retreat. For states that do not require a duty to retreat, we will question their federal funding and assess their Justice Department funding and reduce it by 20%. We'll also decrease the incident of gun violence resulting from vigilantes by reducing by 20% the funds that would otherwise be allocated for that fiscal year to any state that does not require local neighborhood watch programs to be registered with a local enforcement agency, and require the Attorney General, Mr. Speaker, to study Stand Your Ground laws. Let's speak to the pain of the American people. Let's look at ways of fixing the law. I yield back.
Gurley, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to commend an extraordinary young man from Tennessee's 4th Congressional District. Eric Wolf was accepted to and is now attending the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland. Since middle school, Eric has been preparing for a career in the military. He follows the path of both his grandfathers, one who was a Marine and the other a World War II veteran. Eric said that he felt the call to serve his country after reading the book Lone Survivor, which led him to look at what he was doing to give back to our great nation. In addition to his appointment, Eric built a solid reputation in his hometown of Cleveland, Tennessee. He graduated from McCallie High School with a 4.1 GPA and was a star athlete. Eric's drive and unabashed patriotism exemplify the best of our country. I wish him the best of luck and know that he'll make us all proud. I yield back.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. McGovern, for 5 minutes. Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, for the 19th time this year, I rise to talk about my effort to end hunger now. Nearly every week this year, I've stood on this floor and talked about hunger in America and how we can end hunger now. Today, I want to talk about a group of people who are fighting hunger around this country. At first, they may seem like an unlikely group of anti-hunger advocates, but look deeper, and it's easy to see how their connection to good, healthy food makes them natural allies in our efforts to end hunger now. Mr. Speaker, I'm talking about America's chefs, the culinary artists who cook for all of us, whether we're eating at a neighborhood restaurant or fine dining establishments. America's chefs have recognized that hunger and obesity are problems in America, and they know how important access to healthy food is for proper development, no matter what age a hungry or malnourished person is. Chefs across this country, including White House chef Sam Kass, have rallied behind First Lady Michelle Obama's Let's Move campaign, and especially the healthy eating component of her campaign. They understand that healthy food is critical for healthy bodies and minds. But what's less well known is that these same chefs have also picked up the mantle of hunger in America. They realize that hunger and obesity are the opposite sides of the same coin, that it's possible to be hungry and obese simply because you lack money to buy healthy foods, and in many cases healthier options, including fresh fruits and vegetables, simply aren't available. That's why these chefs have been working on eliminating food deserts, those areas, both urban and rural, where there isn't access to low-cost, healthy and nutritious foods. And they've been working with food banks and other anti-hunger organizations on ways to provide food to poor and needy Americans. This includes vigorously defending SNAP and the child nutrition programs. One of the great leaders on hunger from the culinary industry is Tom Colicchio, someone I'm proud to call a friend and ally. Tom wears several hats. He's a successful restaurateur with restaurants across this country from Los Angeles to New York, and he's a television celebrity with his role as judge on Top Chef. But more recently and more importantly to millions of Americans who may never have the opportunity to eat at one of his restaurants, Tom is an advocate for the hungry and for those who are trying to improve their lives. He was a vocal supporter of the Child Nutrition Reauthorization Act that increased funding for school meals in order to improve the nutritional quality of food served at schools. But he's also a producer of the documentary A Place at the Table, a beautifully filmed, heart-wrenching movie about hunger in America. His role in our fight to end hunger now cannot be understated, and his efforts are needed and appreciated. Then there's my dear friend, Chef Jose Andres, who brings a passion and a commitment to ending hunger. He has dedicated himself to raising awareness, challenging policymakers, and giving back to the community in ways both large and small that have really made a difference to ending hunger in America and around the world. And he's not alone. Chefs like Mark Murray, Rachel Ray, Brian Voltaggio, and Charlie Palmer, just to name a few, all lend their names, their restaurants, and themselves to fight to end hunger now. Working through anti-hunger organizations like Share Our Strength, founded and run by my good friend Billy Shore, these chefs are reducing hunger in so many different and unique ways. But it's not just the famous celebrity chefs who are helping. Share Our Strength is a program called Cooking Matters, where chefs teach low-income families healthier ways to cook food, together with their Shopping Matters program, where these same families can learn how to navigate their local markets to purchase the healthiest foods they can afford. These programs are fighting hunger at local levels. And the chefs involved, from Arkansas to Colorado to Massachusetts, are using their expertise to teach these families the healthiest ways to cook food. Chefs are just one of the non-traditional groups that are out in the real world fighting hunger. They are leading by example, and their actions need to be highlighted not just on the House floor, but at the White House, at a White House conference on food and nutrition. Chefs should absolutely be part of such a conference where they can talk about their efforts and ways to help low-income families improve their cooking and eating habits. These chefs and the organizations they partner with are a key part of our fight to end hunger now. I commend them for their dedication, and I look forward to working with them in this effort. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Chair recognizes the gentlelady from California, Ms. Sanchez, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I rise to honor the life of Lillian Kawasaki, who proudly served the Los Angeles community for more than 3 decades, working tirelessly to protect our environment. Lillian was an inspiration and a trailblazer. In 1990, she was named General Manager of the Department of Environmental Affairs for the City of Los Angeles, becoming the first Asian American in city history to be appointed a department chief. It is because of Lillian's leadership and her vision that Los Angeles launched major initiatives in air and water quality protection and environmental cleanup. Local businesses began investing in renewable energy, thanks to Lillian Kawasaki. I had the privilege of working with Lillian when she served as Board of Director for the Water Replenishment District. It would be hard to find a public official more involved in her community than Lillian was. On a personal note, it was an honor for me to call her a close friend. Lillian was an extraordinarily giving person. She always remembered birthdays and anniversaries. She asked me often how my family and my son were doing because she truly cared. I offer my condolences to Lillian's husband, to her family, and to her loved ones. She was a tremendous public servant, a shining example for others, and a generous and truly kind human being, and I will miss her greatly. Thank you, and I yield back.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Kildee, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, the City of Detroit became the largest municipality in our nation's history to file for bankruptcy. And without a doubt, the situation in Detroit is extreme, and their problems in part have been driven by local mismanagement. But it would be an oversimplification, and I think a dangerous oversimplification, for folks to continue to lay the entire responsibility for Detroit's situation on the failure of management. Since last week, Detroit's been on the front page of America's newspapers and has become the recent, I guess, poster child for municipal decline and insolvency. But for the few cities like Detroit that have actually filed bankruptcy, there are many other legacy cities in this country that continue to struggle day in and day out to provide basic services for their residents. Many municipalities are facing not just fiscal insolvency, but service-level challenges, perhaps not on the same scale as Detroit, but that does not mean that they are immune to the problems that Detroit are facing. My own hometown of Flint, Michigan, is on that same path and is struggling every day to provide basic services in an increasing period of fiscal stress. Detroit's bankruptcy should be a call to action, to have a much bigger conversation in this country about how we support and fund our cities and our great metropolitan areas. Cities are where our creativity takes place and where much of our wealth has been generated in the past, and that can and should be the future for America's cities. Let me be clear, bankruptcy for Detroit will not be a solution to its problems or for any other city. While it's arguable that this bankruptcy may be necessary, it will not be sufficient to solve the problem. It may bring order to an otherwise chaotic situation, but it will not solve the problem itself, and it will have real consequences for people in Detroit and southeastern Michigan and the entire state. You know, you can simply dissolve a corporation through bankruptcy, but you can't dissolve a city, which is a place where hundreds of thousands of people in this case live and raise their families. Lots of factors have contributed to the decline of a whole subset of America's cities: population loss, trade policy that moves jobs out of those communities overseas or out of those cities into the metropolitan areas through land use practices, a municipal finance system that fails to recognize the realities of the 21st century. This is a big issue, and it's one that calls for a much larger national conversation about how we support our cities. But first, Mr. Speaker, we have to make sure to do no harm to these places that are struggling. The Republican budget that will come to this floor within the next few weeks proposes deep cuts to programs like the Community Development Block Grant Program and the Home Program, 40% cuts for programs that are intended to help communities reposition themselves in this challenged economy. Yet, at a time when cities are facing distress, like the city of Detroit, my hometown of Flint, many others, and the federal government could provide some help that would be in our national interest, we see cuts proposed to these really important programs. So whether at the state or federal level, we all have a role to play. It's time that all levels of government start thinking about the long-term sustainability of our cities, not just because it's good for those places, because it's in our national interest. Detroit's bankruptcy should be a day of reckoning for all of us, not just for the residents of the Motor City, but for everybody. Rethinking the way we support our cities and our metropolitan areas is not an easy conversation for us to have. It will be tough. It will cause us to challenge conventional thinking and challenge our own views of the importance of cities. These may be tough conversations, but they are absolutely necessary that we have to take on as a nation. We cannot sit idly by and pretend that Detroit won't matter and that it won't affect us and wait for the next Detroit to happen. It's important for our nation, it's important for our people, it's important for our competitiveness, it's important for our economy, it's important that we be a competitive place, and the only way we do that is with vital and rich, growing communities, and we have to get places like Detroit and Flint and Saginaw and Pontiac and other places that are important to this economy back on that trajectory. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Ohio, Ms. Kaptur, for 5 minutes.
Good job, Dan. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to draw attention to the recent rising unacceptable unemployment numbers in some regions of our nation. The fact is, Republicans control this House, and they are not only doing nothing to create jobs in America, they are actually creating more unemployment. In my home state of Ohio, the unemployment rate jumped up to 7.2%. In the city of Cleveland, the unemployment rate rose from 9% to 10.1% over the past month. In the city of Lorain, unemployment dramatically rose from 8.7 to 10.6%. And in the city of Toledo, we saw an increase in unemployment from 8.7 to 9.3%. Nationally, the unemployment rate remains stuck at 7.6%, but in too many neighborhoods across our country, unemployment is a daily reality. When you incorporate labor underutilization, the real national unemployment rate is actually 14.3%. There are currently 11.8 million, nearly 12 million unemployed people in this country. 4.3 million people have been jobless for 27 weeks or more and are considered long-term unemployed. New federal government employment has declined by 65,000 persons over the past 12 months. 65,000 more people spit out. The unemployment rate for the construction industry is 9.8%. Manufacturing employment has declined in the past 4 straight months. Do those job numbers sound like an economic recovery to you? What is the Republican response to these dubious unemployment and jobs numbers? Block the president. So what do? Let's repeal the Affordable Care Act 38 times. And they try to do that. Let's not appoint budget conferees so we can negotiate a budget deal that puts people to work and strengthens the middle class. No. Let's ignore the harmful effects of sequestration. Sequestration is arguably the primary driver of these poor job numbers, and the Budget Office estimates just the unemployment resulting from sequestration costs our economy an additional 1.5% in lost economic growth. Remember when the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office estimated that sequestration would reduce economic growth and cost about 750,000 jobs? Well, they were right. We're seeing the effect of that today. The sequester was the largest cause of the negative growth numbers in the 4th quarter of last year. According to the Bureau of Economic Analysis, the economy is growing far slower than expected, despite the fact that personal consumption and business inventory spending have increased recently. You would think that if consumer and business spending is up, we would see strong GDP growth, given that our economy is based on consumer spending. Unfortunately, this is where the sequester and the Republican policy of cut and run, cut and run, cut and run comes into play. Government spending has declined in 11 of the last 13 quarters since the first quarter of 2010. We may have seen robust growth if we took a sensible long-term approach to deficit reduction instead of using the Meat Act's Republican short-sighted sequester and steep, unfair budget cuts. They're even kicking thousands of mentally ill citizens out of their assisted housing. Thousands, over 27,000 people who can't make it on their own, being kicked out of shelters across this country. With the Republicans refusing to replace their mindless sequester, 600,000 civilian defense workers are currently being furloughed. The economic impact of these defense furloughs will be the loss of over an estimated $2 trillion for our economy. Just in Ohio, 22,000 furloughs in the civilian defense sector. The policies of this Republican House are hampering robust economic growth across our country. The Federal Reserve agrees with what I am saying. At a recent hearing, the chair of the Fed said the economic recovery has continued at a moderate pace in recent quarters despite the strong headwinds created by federal fiscal policy. Unfortunately, Republicans will likely continue to refuse to compromise and focus on slowing the economy even further. We've already cut spending by $2.5 trillion. That has real impacts on job creation. Discretionary spending is at its lowest level in 45 years. The federal deficit is projected to be at its lowest level in recent memory, and the Treasury has actually even recently made payments on the national debt. We need a jobs bill here, not more reckless cuts. The President has a plan. The Republicans don't. I would urge my Republican colleagues, bring to the floor the President's jobs agenda. Let's show America which party is committed to job creation in this country, not more stalling. I yield back the balance of my time.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Puerto Rico, Mr. Pierre Luisi, for 5 minutes. Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, as we approach the birthday of the late Dr. José Celso Barbosa, the father of the statehood movement in Puerto Rico, I rise to update my colleagues on the progress that has been made to resolve the territory's political status. Last November, Puerto Rico held a referendum. As I described in a floor speech the following week, the results show that a majority of the U.S. citizens of Puerto Rico do not support the current territory status. A supermajority favors statehood among the three alternative options, and more voters want statehood than any other option, including the current status. These results are now part of the historical record, and they cannot be dismissed or diminished by those who find them inconvenient. Now that American citizens living in an American territory have informed their national government in a free and fair vote that they do not consent to a political status that deprives them of the most basic democratic rights, it is incumbent upon the federal government to take appropriate action in response. For the President and Congress to do otherwise would be to contravene the principles that have made this country a light to the world. Today, I can report that positive steps have been taken. In April, the administration requested an appropriation of $2.5 million, which would be provided to the Puerto Rico Elections Commission to conduct the first federally funded status vote in the territory's history, with the specific purpose of resolving this issue. The administration's action was favorably received by members of Congress from both sides of the aisle, who rarely find common ground. Earlier this month, thanks to the leadership of Congressmen Wolf, Fatah, and Serrano, that funding was approved by the Appropriations Committee, confirming that the effort to secure fair treatment for Puerto Rico is not and should never become a partisan issue. The committee's report endorses the conditions proposed by the administration, stating that federal funding will not be obligated until DOJ has certified that the ballot and voter education materials are compatible with U.S. laws and policies, thereby ensuring that the vote will deal with one or more status options that can actually be implemented and that would settle the issue. I will continue to fight for the approval of this appropriation by the full House and for its retention in any conference negotiation with the Senate. There is additional progress to report on another front in this struggle. In May, I introduced standalone legislation that proceeds from the indisputable premise that statehood obtained more votes than any other option in the November referendum. The bill outlines the rights and responsibilities of statehood and voters in Puerto Rico whether they accept those terms. If a majority says yes, the bill provides for the President to submit legislation to admit Puerto Rico as a state after a transition period. 2 months after its introduction, this bill already enjoys support from 100 members of Congress from both parties and every region of this country, despite the predictable opposition of the status quo party in Puerto Rico and its allies in Congress. I always find it ironic when some of my colleagues from the states, who along with their constituents enjoy all the benefits of statehood, seek to prevent my constituents from exercising those same rights and responsibilities. I have concluded that these forces cannot be reasoned with. They must simply be defeated, and they will be. Next week, I will appear as a witness at a Senate hearing on the November referendum and the federal response to that vote. Just as I told a United Nations committee last month, I will testify that I have faith that the federal government will fulfill its obligation to facilitate Puerto Rico's transition to a democratic and dignified status, but that deeds, not words, are required. Much work remains to be done, and like any civil rights struggle, it will not be easy, but through our sound and steady action, we are closer than ever to finally realizing Dr. Barbosa's dream of equality for the U.S. citizens of Puerto Rico. I yield back.
Pursuant to Clause 12, paren A of Rule 1,